calling her Patsy in our community. So she was quoted for the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, lifting the voices of family members. For those of you that don't know, Patricia had a sister that was, when she was 29, Daisy Mayhe, who was Yakama Nation and a Warm Springs tribal member that went missing in 1987. So she has had decades of experience, unfortunately, with missing relatives and murdered relatives. And we always kind of get her guidance on a lot of the different topics that we cover, as well as the conversation. And we wanted to share one of her things that she says to kind of set that intention today, especially to lift up and elevate again the MMIW, MMIP voices. So it is imperative that our family voices are shared, heard, and respected, particularly as it pertains to our families and loved ones who endure this crisis daily for years in silence. As families of missing and murdered women, we simply seek calm and peace, a sense of justice, and healing of our hearts. And this is Patricia White, but she has many amazing photos. She's frequently cited. She's a lifelong educator. And this is the one that she selected for this time around. Okay, and just for those of you that are just tuning in, we are live at Portland, Oregon, the Pacific Northwest History Conference. And I'm here as your host, Emily Washings, together with Robyn Pebeahsy and our guest today, Diane Pebeahsy. And I'm going to scoot it over to Robyn for introduction. This is going to be fun little dance with the mic.
You guys hear me? Okay, I think our mic will pick up. Okay. So I'm Robyn Pebeahsy, and I did a lot of research on the Yakama Reservation with human subjects, community participatory research with the University of Washington, and with different projects about mental health on the reservation. I also went to UW, majored in American Indian Studies, and I worked as a grant writer for the Peacekeeper Society. I currently still volunteer as a grant writer there. I currently work for the Boys and Girls Club of the Yakama Nation, and I'm a grant writer there as well. And in 2020, I remember approaching Emily for the idea of putting together War Cry because it was COVID and we had all this content and that we wanted to get out. And so that was kind of, so 2024, so we've been doing this for 4 years, and it's been great.
Thank you, Robyn. And for those of you that haven't listened to our podcast before, we were really within our Yakama community, we're looking at a frequent number of missing. We have the highest per capita in the state of missing Indigenous people out of all of the different tribes that are reported and documented correctly. It's a nice little asterisk for everybody in here that has to frequently deal with those numbers and knows that sometimes there's undercounts and underreporting in urban areas. But we were finding that so much the information and the content, there would be newspaper articles and news clippings and people even from this area that were helping out. And I would get questions from other people that span from relatives to non-natives that were asking me like, well, what was going on? What's happening? And I have, 3 young children. So to be in community, I have to switch from like picking up a Slurpee, like something that's just supposed to be fun, to like a really heavy content. And they're asking me to summarize that. We noted, both Robyn and I noticed, like we're getting asked frequently to summarize information. And we're kind of problem solvers. Robyn, I frequently saw in the library growing up. In the back table at the tribe, if you wanted to know where Robyn was in 1997, circa. Reading a book, right, Diane? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we thought, what if we have a podcast that is like, if we're just sitting around a diner having coffee and somebody else is at the next table hearing us. So that was the style of this. We try to have conversations amongst each other and bring up really critical and important things. And sometimes things that are kind of scary, right? Like if I'm really pushing myself. I think, what am I really scared to say? And maybe that's where I need to bring it, and the strength I'll get from having community. So I teach at the Evergreen State College. I also teach at Yakima Valley College. I'm a proud Cuthla to Elora, which is back there. Um, she is just turned 1. It's her first podcast here. And I also have different case studies that are connected with the Evergreen Native cases, which are open source. Those have teaching notes as well. One is called War Cry, and the other one is called Who Has MMIP Task Forces. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to our guest today, Diane Pebeahsy.
Hi, Shechmaitsky, Shema, Inanimoma, be with you. Imi Pashtiniwa, Diane Pebeahsy. I am just going off of that. I'm not going to read I'm like, what was written? I am Yakima and Comanche. I'm 2 tribes. I have lived most of my life on the Yakima Reservation, which is across the way in Eastern Washington. I have 4 children, 3 living. I like to powwow. I love to craft. But just recently I worked almost 30 years for the tribe, Yakima tribe, but now I work for a nonprofit called Peacekeepers Society. I've enjoyed working for the tribe all those years in different types of things. I've been a judge for our tribe. I have been a social worker. I've also been, but I first started off, my most loving job I loved amongst all was when I was 19, my first job was working as a Head Start teacher. You learn a lot from kids. And throughout my career, I end up working at AAOA, Area of Aging, and they're not that different than teenagers. So I worked from little kids to elders. Then my last thing is I worked with teenagers, young adults in the leadership. And I can tell you, working all these different jobs where I'm able to reach different parts and get to witness moments of time with different people at their ages of it's extraordinary. And I'm one of those that will sit there and get to watch them at this time, but I feel like I'm a watcher and someone who gets to kind of catalog things of what was happening to them. So I'm really happy I have that. I am a executive director of the nonprofit, a whole different hustle. Those who know what nonprofits are all about, it's a real different hustle than working for the tribe. But one of the things that I do that's different, I do a lot of little different things, but one of the things that is near and dear to my heart is I'm a grief recovery specialist. I help with grief recovery and on our Yakima reservation, especially when we're going to hit some heavy topics. I am really glad to be able to have that service, though it's a service just like anybody who wants to quit smoking, you have to want it. And we'll get more into that as we go along. But I just want to let you know, I've did a lot of different things, but this is what has led me in my life's journey. And I'm glad to be part of, War Cry, because I remember, and I tell and those who don't know, that's my younger sister, this Robyn right here. She's, I am generation, what is it, X, and she's the one who helps me, manage through the time of what's going on. And I'm very thankful to her. But I remember the day she came home and said, hey, I have this idea. And this idea is bringing these wonderful women together to talk about such a subject, which hits us all and is sometimes something we don't see happening. So I'll give it back to them and I'll jump in when they're ready.
Well, don't go far. You're gonna answer this question too. Okay, so I love themes and really trying to connect to themes. I think it really can, give us something to expand and think upon. So of course, the theme of this conference is history everywhere all at once. So I just wanted to turn to Robyn and Diane, and then I'll answer lastly, because I have visuals with my answer. How has history been a part of your life and work?
I will let my sister start with that.
Sometimes we
Okay.
go oldest to youngest.
Yeah,
so that's-
At order, you have to go to, like,
So I guess my relation to the theme in which history everywhere all at once is definitely when it comes to being just a human being. I feel that history shows up and you get to see other people's hopes and dreams. And sometimes, if not that, you see the lessons in which hopes and dreams we try to accomplish. So for me, history repeats itself, right? That's what we learn. And sometimes we learn and sometimes we don't. And I and that's okay. That means we begin to go forth. But with this theme, history everywhere all at once, it really is bringing everything you have on the table and really not saying what's good and bad, but really looking at what can we do to improve? What can, what went well? What can we improve? And what was it I remember? So I that's how I kind of think about it, and I'm kind of liking how that just spreads out. So
Okay, Robyn has ceded her time to me for the time being, and we'll go back to her. So if you can click to the next slide. What came up for me and what I wanted to share was this aspect and dynamic that we can have different interpretations of history, and those can center and be confused on one basic question. Right? Like, so who started the Yakima War? Like 90% of historians will focus and say something different than what Yakima tribal members or other tribes will say, which is, next slide, that the Yakima War started from the violence towards Yakima women and children. And we have Yakima historical accounts by Atwai Alex Saluskin that talks about these miners that came and killed the wife and daughter and baby in the board of Moose Hill. And then Moose Hill and two of his friends killed the white people or murderers. This is largely erased from the historical written record by white men and women. So for those of you that don't know about the Yakima War, there was about 370 victims that died violently, September 1855 to November 1858, which were considered soldiers, chiefs, warriors, volunteers, civilians, non-combatants, women, and children. This is sourced from Joe Miles's historical research. His book is called Kamaikan Country. He's a local Yakima historian. I also wanted to share, and I appreciate Diane being here today, because there's also different things in this process in history that are difficult to revisit. And then there's also things that can either help center us or that we get curious about. So one of the areas that we have as a legendary site is called Eel Trail, or Assume in our language. Biologists will now say this is Pacific lamprey, but our elders have said you got one chance to interpret what that word was, and you said eels, so that's what they are. You can go get mad at your relatives for giving us the wrong word. We're not calling it nothing else. But in a lot of the historical accounts, you can see them discuss and talking about coming down Eel Trail. And one of our hunters took photos of Eel Trail, which you can still see has a zigzag pattern today. So this is one of the frequently traveled sites that's there. And I'm interested in, asking and discussing maybe how places can help center us and be a component of any kind of grief with this. So you have these period where we had the largest treaty gathering in the United States by multiple tribes that took place. And then a few months later, you have a 3-year fight that persisted until, people either surrendered, fled the region, were executed, with the last of the hangings taking place at, what is now called Fort Simcoe, but we traditionally called Mulmul. Oh. And I'm gonna turn it back over to Robyn about, to answer the question now that she's a little more settled. So Robyn, how has history been a part of your life and work?
Okay.
Whatever you want me to grab, whatever you want me.
There's so much technology over here.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm leery to touch any, mess with any of the technology.
So, before we get into that, so we are live streaming, so if you happen to be on the page, if you could share it. So it's War Cry Podcast, on Facebook and then also on our YouTube page. So one of the things that I see, currently impacting my life in terms of history, especially the history of our people, is directly related to MMIWs, directly related to this. I recently had an uncle pass away. And he had a name, Alipama was his Yakama name that was given to him as an adult. So sometimes you get names as a young person or a child, but sometimes you get renamed as an adult to kind of encompass that new part of your life. And Alipama was actually a treaty signer. And so sometimes when Emily goes into the history of the treaty and how the conflicts directly lead up to this signing. I think about my relative and my ancestor who was there and wonder what they went through. And so with the passing of my uncle, we've had to go through some historical family records that were handwritten by my grandmother. And it took a long time because she herself was a legal secretary, so she actually kept really great records. And so we were trying to figure out like, well, where did the line come from Alipama? And so we were trying to start with us because we do want to name our cousin that name as he grows into a man and will continue on the name within our family. But it was kind of difficult. We're like, wait, so like my sister's name is Be With You, who was in that line with Alipama. We're like, well, who was Be With You to Alipama? Oh, that was his sister. So, we had to go through all of almost like this little maze and of riddles that were left in all of these writings. Reminding me a little bit of the Bible, you're like so-and-so begot so-and-so. And you're just trying to figure out like, well, who are these people? And so, so we did figure it out. It was about 7 generations back, if not more, back to the, obviously 1855, because that's when Alipama was there to sign the treaty. And so that was always so amazing to find. And so my cousins and I are always trying to stay in touch with each other because I have cousins in Oregon, and in Iowa, and in Alaska. And so we're trying to come together and they're kind of like really wanting to know that history. And it's really interesting because my sister and I will sit there. We're trying to figure it out. It's like, okay, she said it like this. And if you ever watch Game of Thrones, it's like, okay, there's like 3 Aegons and like 2 generations. Which one is it? And so it's the same thing with us. So we have various Wuluchus, which is my grandmother's name, various Elitbamas. And so I loved my grandma because she was like, this is Wuluchu 1. And so she would label it 1, and this is 2, and this one is 3. So I always appreciated that because that meant my grandmother, while she very heavily depended on the oral history, which is very important because you have to be present for oral history to get that. She also understood and valued written systems because she knew that's where it would go. And she knew because her family would go into this different parts of the state, she wouldn't be able to always connect with them. So I was always really impressed and blown away about some of the things that she would write about and how she wrote them with us in mind, that we would be sitting there one day looking through it and trying to figure it out. And so I feel like in terms when it comes to the content that we're looking at today is non-natives who try to control the narrative of history during that time also have that forethought. What was their intention when it comes across, I'm going to tell a story this way, You know, and we've seen it all in history books. We've seen it all in different books, which we'll get into. What's the purpose? And it is to, only create one pathway, because it's almost like, history is almost like a waterfall almost, so it's like there's a clear pathway, you'll see people go down those pathways. And so it's like they know that there's only one vein for this stream to go, and we're the only ones writing about it. So that's the only thing that they're ever gonna see. I'm gonna be the only voice that's going to be determining how people envision or relive or take into account this historical event. And so in terms of my family history, my grandmother understood that, so she tried to write it as thoroughly as possible with, I know, with her truth. And so we're always saying be very critical of what you're reading, and please controlling the narrative of those stories. And so later on, we'll go into like, well, who's telling these stories? Like, were they actually there? Who are they listening to? Is this a retelling? You know, those kind of things. But anyway, that's how history probably impacted me personally.
Yeah, and the history everywhere all at once really fits into our theme, because sometimes we have what scholars call like more of a circular or round. We don't have a direct linear from point A to B about sharing or talking or teaching or learning. Okay, so I had some broader questions that are kind of enduring questions, so you can feel free to utilize, you know, if you show the, for those of the educators in the room, if you wanted to show this podcast in your class and ask these questions to your students, I feel like it helps. Ask that of yourselves. Like, why are there still historical inaccuracies regarding natives? What specifically in history books or historical records can we share about the Yakima War? Right, so I was able to go to the Smithsonian in February and had they really amazing different exhibits, and they printed out historical documents, and then they had a bunch of different insights from tribal members that were called out in different texts to give context and history. And I loved that. And so this is my way of kind of emulating that, even though I'm not Smithsonian, of course. All right, next slide. So in speaking to the theme, history everywhere all at once, I searched for descendants of the Yakima War that fought against my relatives. And one of those descendants shared this article that talks about Hiram Crabtree. This is actually their relative. This is a newspaper article that talks about the start of the Yakima War. And it claims that that it was the father that, you know, was fighting with somebody, and then so the Yakima War broke out. However, you know, this didn't start as a result of a quarrel between Hiram Crabtree. It started as a result of violence towards Yakima women and children. And in fact, the father never even lived in Yakima. So why do we have, you know, this historical record, and Alex Saluskin, of course, wrote the out the historical record, and those are rarely cited. Yet we have somebody that has never even lived in the Yakima Valley that can make claims, and they get quoted in newspapers, and those never get, you know, fixed. So it's interesting that, you know, the descendant of him would recognize that they wanted to stop that process of erasing Native women and to try to correct the historical record. How do we do that? Well, we did write a letter to the editor at Yakima Herald and asked them for a correction to the article. And the editor that's in charge of that didn't know what to do with it, and then he left after he printed it. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but it's really interesting when you give people some uncomfortableness, right? Like when you give them some of that everywhere all at once, they get, you know, how the reactions are. Next we have the Olympia, after defending the attacks on our Yakima women and children, the Olympia Pioneer and Democrat, it's a newspaper, said that Yakima should be rubbed out and blotted from existence. So having a genocidal statement that's published in newspapers and is a part of a historical record, yet a large part of historians, a majority of them, don't talk about Yakimans like that. They talk about us as being overly emotional about the treaty, about being bloodthirsty, like villains, like, they're describing something off of a Halloween costume. And why is that? We also have, again, this source is from Jamaican Country Joe Miles. We have General Wool was very critical of the governors at that time, talking about the two civil governors, quote unquote, private war. And he said that they accomplished anything more than an unwise, unnecessary, and extravagant expedition for no other reason than to plunder the treasury of the United States and to make political capital for somebody. Wool complained to the assistant adjutant general in New York that Indians would not make war if the authorities of Washington Territory would treat them with ordinary justice. Governor Stevens is crazy and does not know what he is doing. Why isn't this in our history books for our kids? Why don't we share about even generals that don't get along with governors? Like, why are we eliminating that? And further, what kind of language is used when natives are killed compared to when white men are killed? So this is a historylink.org terminology when Indigenous women are killed. And this is still up there. I checked it. It gets edited every once in a while after I maybe say something about one of their articles. Miners were heavily laden with supplies on mules and were sometimes known to steal horses and to greatly mistreat Indigenous women. Mistreat. Okay, the historylink.org terminology when white men are killed. Some of the Yakima warriors had retaliated by killing miners in isolated incidents. In late September 1855, Andrew J. Bolin, the Indian sub-agent at the Dells, was shot and killed while investigating these incidents. It was for this reason that Major Haller and his troops set out from the Dells for the Yakima Valley. Different terminology. People are dead. And now they have cited Major Haller. So this historian, maybe they had, this book that had very limited Yakima War stuff, but they've cited Major Haller. And let's see, what did Major Haller write in his journal? Major Haller was a quote unquote known Indian fighter. He fought in the Mexican War, fought down in the Seminoles, fought the Shoshone-Bannock. When they were calling him, they were calling the US's known Indian fighter to march down and find and get those Yakimas. And when he arrived, he was surprised to see that they had amassed over 1,000 warriors. And he was the type of major that remembered this kind of thing. He was like, why were they so mad? Right, the war stretched out 3 years. This is Yakima's first reported case of MMIW in 1855. The US response was a 3-year war. The US has never revisited that decision. They have never apologized for that decision. I've sat and looked at US senators in the face and reminded them that. I went to presidential administrations and reminded of them that with my post-it note speech prepared. So in 1856, when Major Haller had returned to Yakima areas because the war is still going on, he decided to ask around. And then he decided to take what information he was getting and then asked for his old journal. So he asked Henrietta down in Oregon, while she's drying clothes or whatever she has to do in 1856, to send his journals on up to Yakima, which she does. I always like to include like any contributions of women, whether it be native or non-native, like, right? Like, oh my gosh, I gotta do all this stuff and I'm like the only one of 3 women around and now I gotta send his journals up, She could easily said, dude, I'm busy, but she didn't. And when he looked at his journals from 1855, cross-referenced it with what he was hearing, he then found out that the reason that we were quote unquote so upset and were able to get allies. So right, yeah, they call it the Yakima War, but it wasn't only just Yakima tribal members that were fighting in that war. We had allies from other tribes. He then journaled, "The Yakimas were justified in their actions against me." Why don't we read about this in the history books? And then this is a contribution from seventh graders that I wanted to highlight and elevate. You know, we still have inaccurate history in a book that schools still use. I went and met with a middle school teacher, saw it on their desk. I was like, "You still use this?" "Yes." And it inaccurately claims that it was unhappiness for the treaty as the reason for the war site starting. You know, this erases the violence against Yakama women that occurred and does not mention it once. And I'm not the only one that has noticed this. I got a letter from some seventh graders in Snohomish County. Snohomish County, some seventh graders got together and they wrote a letter, and this is what their critique of, they had watched a panel presentation I gave about Haller and the Yakima War, and then they cross-referenced it with the information they were reading. So they were seventh grade in 2022, so probably ninth graders now, 10th graders, high schoolers. This was a part of a longer letter, but this is the selection I picked out. "We thought it was interesting that Haller wrote in the journal that Yakima War was started because of violence towards Native American women. However, in the history book that we have been using as a historical resource and informational reference this year, it says nothing about Haller's journal writings, even though our historical books are supposed to tell us our past truths, brutal or not. It does not state that there were it does state that there were gold prospectors on the natives' land, but it says nothing about them abusing the Native American women." Like, this generation is just not gonna stand for like this anymore. All right, I'm gonna turn to Robyn. And she had a handout. If you haven't had this handout, we have a couple more, and you can let me know and I'll bring it.
Okay, well, if he's handing that out, I'm going to read what's on the handout. It's an article published December 10, 1910. "The dusky maidens of the Yakima Indian Reservation are receiving no end of attention from white suitors. Many a mixed blood marriage has been made lately because of the money that Indian maids bring their husbands. A Toppenish quarter breed was recently married to a white man after a 2 weeks courtship. She owns a well-placed allotment of Indian lands, and her mother's real estate is figured at $50,000. A pretty Indian belle who is still heart whole and fancy free, although she has many admirers among the pale faces as well as among the redskins, is the daughter of Josephine Lilly. The mother is a really remarkable Indian woman whose allotment of land was within the present town of Toppenish. She conducted a real estate business there and has just put up a fine stone apartment house and is said to own one of Toppenish weekly papers. She has been twice married to white men, and her daughter has been brought up in a Portland convent." It was kind of hard to figure out where this was circulated, but I had to reference the book that we had first seen this in, and it was circulating in Oklahoma City. So I was looking at the term dusky maiden, and this isn't the only place that has ever been used. It's something that has been described for essentially indigenous women, not limited to Yakima or Native American. So a quote that I found in an article written by A. Murata Tamura, a central component of these early romantic constructions was the ubiquitous image of the sexually receptive and alluring Polynesian maiden, an image that was deployed to good effect in the works of artists such as William Hodges, John Weber, and later Paul Gauguin. And so she had just rewritten how artists either dismiss the term or they reclaim it. So they do different art pieces to reclaim, this is who we really are. And so when you read it, you kind of like, well, what is the language? So I like that Emily talked about the language. when you're talking about Native people in terms of like a violent skirmish or a violent event that had happened versus how they talk about white people when that happens, white soldiers, white men when that happens. So it's the same thing on more of a, not so much on a war front, but on like a media front. So Yakima Dusky Maidens, with the language they use essentially is to indicate that like they're fast. They have a lot of resources, yet can still be seen as pure and untouched, referenced by like the end portion say that she was brought up in a convent, you know, but she's probably gonna be fast, you know, kind of like alluring to that. And so other terms that were just bring things out. So money that Indian maids bring their husbands. So the money that they have is not to be of their own, it's for their husbands. Married after 2 weeks of courtship, so you don't have to know them very long for them to want to marry you. This story is an article creates resemblances, and it resembles the attitude of like Killers of the Flower Moon, which is you have this resource, like the women are now the resource of wealth. And it is for a white man to take advantage of, to exploit her for her money and land, and then leave her. You know, that's kind of what it was about. And so then that brings us to Killers of the Flower Moon. And so both of these articles and these stories are very close to me. As my sister mentioned, we have two tribes. So we grew up here in the Northwest, but we have a very strong connection to our Oklahoma roots because we're both have Comanche from our father's side. And so I'll later talk about the Comanches, but in 1920s in Oklahoma, it was a book later made into a film. And while the story tells a historical message about MMIW, kind of like a version of MMIW that has happened, it is still written and told by a non-native. And so when we talk about those veins of like streams coming from a waterfall, like this vein, still a native is not telling it. When the story is translated into film, the story was more sympathetic to the white character husband and his love in relationship with Molly, the Osage woman. So a lot of the times the Osage tried to really support the project when it was turned into a film. I was trying to find some anything written by the tribe to talk about just the book, but like the internet is so flooded with the film, it was actually really hard to kind of figure out like, well, what was their perception of the book? Because I know a lot of tribes, if it's not written by a native, they will have issues with it because it won't take into account their words or it'll change their words. So again, it resembles the Dusky Maidens Are in Demand, which is marry an Osage woman for her land and money, and you'll attain quick generational wealth. But in the end, the Osage, both men and women, are disposable after you obtain their wealth. And so this brings me to my other tribe, which is the Comanche Nation. So if you look on the other side of the handout, there's a resolution written there by the Comanche Nation that came out on October 5th of this year. And so it's talking particularly about this book, Empire of the Summer Moon by S.C. Gwynn. And so it's going to be about around the 1830s to the 1850s because it's about Quanah Parker and his mother. So his mother, Cynthia Ann, was a white woman who was captured by Comanches, and then she had become a part of the tribe and she had given birth to several Parker children. But according to the Washington State Patrol MMIP list, so the missing indigenous peoples list that they update pretty regularly. If you look at a lot of the tribes, particularly we concentrate on Yakima because that's where we're from, we tend to have a very equal men and women who are missing. And we tend to have a very equal like youth to adult ratio. So it's almost like split down the middle, which also means that men tend to get the inverse of what the women get in terms of history and depictions in books. So like you get the Dusky Maiden narrative, but with men, they tend to get like an over-sexualized savage, especially when you're talking about Comanches. If you think of, I can't remember if it's Stagecoach. It's a John Wayne film anyway, and it's about Comanches. It is essentially that to where the Comanche men are so horrible that women get crazy because they're captured because of the mistreatment of the men put against them. So the Comanche Nation in this resolution denounces Empire of the Summer Moon by S.C. Gwen. And this was prompted by a deal that they've heard, or that is actually going to happen. And it's a director who does like Yellowstone. And if you see kind of like their style, it's very violent. And it's not to say that our history isn't violent, but I just want to say that a lot of times history, when it's depicted of Native people, especially those in the plains and the era they're going to talk about, it really amps up the dramatization and traumatization towards our young people and the Native people that watch it, because it's like constant violence. And again, because Natives aren't at the forefront of those depictions, it just makes you feel like a little ashamed, you know, at least when I watch it. I'm just like, oh man, you know, that's just how we're always looked at. And it's always set back in the Wild West. Never putting into account current Comanche people or Native people and their narratives that we have now. So I was just wondering how Native men would be represented in this upcoming project, this film project. And they're often portrayed as perpetrators of violence and rape, especially towards white women in these active narratives. Okay. So I'm just going to read here. This is what the Comanche Nation says. So Gwen purposefully eschewed use of Comanche resources in writing his book. As a result of his over-reliance on ethnocentric resources, the book repeats many inaccuracies and stereotypes concerning the Comanche people. And so that was earlier this month, and it was live broadcast, and like, we're publishing it, there it goes. And so I was trying to say, well, what does S.C. Gwen say about his resources? So he was on Joe Rogan. So I just watched the video. So I met with some of them, he's talking about Comanches, and I know some of them. Some of them are on my website, but as far as interviewing them for things that happened 200 to 300 years old, years ago, that's sort of a non-starter for a historian. And mind you, at this meeting that the Comanche Nation had, they had direct descendants from Quanah Parker. So they would have direct oral stories from what those historical events look like, what they got from the grandfather. And so the descendants of Quanah Parker said, yeah, you know, publish this, denounce it, and publish it. Okay, so this is just a list of inaccurate Native representations, and the list could go on. There's like books about this too, but I just thought I'd scratch a little bit off the top. So obviously they don't take into account descendants and their stories that they've held from their families, like oral recollections of historical events. Like I said, that Diane and I went through our own lineage, and we've heard stories from our grandmother who did go to boarding school, and she remembers talking to her grandmother. She does not take into account oral histories that we know we still participate in. How do these stories and portrayal affect us now as really living relatives? So when we see these misinterpreted stories with some kind of narrative that a non-native has, how does that affect us as people now? And of course, it just lumps Native people into an era that is still not current. So we're still stuck in the 1800s, early 1900s in Western or Western era movies and depictions. Because our history is so gruesome at many points, we do get kind of like a constant dramatization and traumatization from like watching these most horrible points in our history shown to the masses on screen for entertainment. Sometimes it's not even necessary to the narrative or to the story, and it's just a little too gruesome. Where is the Native voice in all of these narratives and historical retelling? Projects greenlit by studios are based on non-Native authors and sources. Sweeping assumptions of why history played out the way that it did, often overlooking nuances of a very unique Native culture that fits into a narrative concentrated on a white protagonist. So there was I had seen other accounts of Osage people talking about the killers of the flower moon. They're like, they kind of like really just made this overarching story, like, because we found oil. You know, and it wasn't about because that they understood their land before the United States came in and said, hey, we're claiming all of this, we don't like this land. So it was almost like the United States felt like they were duped and they didn't like it. And so, well, we're gonna tell a story this way, like they just didn't know oil was there. Generations of people knew oil was there. You know, that kind of thing is just overlooked a lot of the times. Further feeds into the fetishization and over-sexualization and general encouragement to take advantage of Native women and men because they do not understand their wealth that they have or their resource or their land or money. So just like Manifest Destiny and the People Bowls, like these people are savages. They don't understand what they have. So we are the ones who are here to call upon to show them or to take it. So that seems to be like the general overarching of a lot of these narratives, as well as like history in general. That's
Okay. And, thank you, Robyn. Like I said, I think we decided to really take this annotator, role with this, for some reason, and we just thought, let's just start critiquing. And let's see, if anybody contacts us or gets mad or whatever, we'll just go with it. Let's just, I mean, I started with a few slides and then we just started going. It was the history link, I think. It was the red marking, the history link that got us going on this. You know, but as a part of this process, there are, of course, different things that come up. There's grief, there's historical trauma. And so I just had this broader question about how is Indigenous knowledge informing our current understanding of historical trauma? And for me, you know, in my work in studying the Yakima War, I would frequently get very emotional. I didn't understand. I didn't even know the term historical trauma existed. But I would go look at, you know, the different weapons that would be used against our people. And I asked my husband, John Olney Schellenberger, to draw an image, or I'm in a wing dress and standing ahead of one of those weapons, those howitzers, and still having like our hand over our heart, as our people do when we frequently for different ceremonies or just when we're processing, as an aspect of strength and both vulnerability. You know, to be able to stand like that in that kind of stance when you're next to a weapon, I believe that depicted that range of it, which also speaks to, of course, this term war cry, right? Like I believe that war cry is a balance of strength and vulnerability. And I also believe that war cry can mean something different to each of us, right? But when I was publishing my case study, my editor had a lot of different emails with a lot of different titles for the case. And I finally landed on war cry because it felt the most authentic to my voice. I can't be the person that I am and need to be for my community if I'm only just strong when I talk about this. And I can't be the person that I need to be for my community and my family and my girls if I'm only just vulnerable when I talk about this. So I believe that, you know, that's how Indigenous knowledge and experience is informing our understanding of historical trauma and grief. And do I want to turn back to you and then to Diane, or do you want Diane? Let's go Diane, Robyn, and then we'll go back to you.
Okay. All right, we're gonna shift a little bit on some of the work that's happened on the Yakima Reservation. And that's dealing with a lot of our elders that have been part of a group that we've started, and something that's really kind of awesome. And I want you guys to kind of zone in on yourself, on something that keeps you limited in your life. And what is that? Just kind of have that on the back burner, you know. Grief recovery on the Yakima Reservation. Grief becomes incomplete, unfinished business. What is grief? Well, as states here, grief is a normal and natural reaction to loss, an underrated human experience, conflicting feelings caused by the end of something and a familiar pattern. The feeling to reach out for somebody, who's always been there. And only to discover when you need them, they're no longer there. And that was a quote from an elder to describe what grief means to them. Grief is life limiting. It brings, grief recovery method of what we did and with quotes, and then also what I've seen, it brings back the quality of life. It keeps us from becoming isolated, because grief is, when you see 100% loss, you feel it 100%. Grief also restricts your day-to-day life. And one thing for sure is sometimes when we are all the history all at once, we're not living in the moment. And that's what restricts us, and that's what grief is. So that's not a bad thing, it just is. So, a lot of times when we think about grief, what is it we hear about grief? What are, don't feel bad. Replace the loss. If your dog dies, get a new one. Grieve alone. It takes time. I've known some people who've carried a grief for over like 80 years. Time meant nothing. As we see in some of the historical writings, we are carrying the grief even through us. Be strong. Men, don't cry. Keep busy. Idle hands. I heard that one before. The more you suffer shows the more you love them. You can think, can you think of any more? And you can think about that. And I'm gonna put some in there. A loss of a child, people will say, just be glad you can have another one. That's that, replace the loss. If you love them, you'll never stop grieving. I think what this really looks at, and when we're dealing with looking at history and looking at how we can better have a different way to see the future, is really begin to be clear and to begin, like I said, when we have all our history laid on the table, maybe we need to take something off to see and focus on really where we want to go. Because grief is, a lot of times with these sayings and the grief of the midst of grief is we are looking at it in an intelligent way when it's really an emotionally charged. And I know this is weird to talk about, especially when we're talking about history, but it's interlaced. It's the thread which keeps us, people like, yeah, history, you can look at it and not have feeling. No, it is a story. It's your comic book. It's your telemundo. It's your everything you want it to be. It's soap opera made real, and it's real life. Let me ask you, when we talk about, when I told you those griefs, did anybody ever hear that and all your grief and pain went away because they told you that? I always think that to myself, and so, I think that, and I feel like having that, instead of feeling pain, I always think like, wow, that I know that this person came up to me and was trying to help me. And then I'm cynical, and us natives, and I think all of us know this, we carry a dark humor at times. I'm like, oh, wow, I'm all better now, and that's not, that's not the truth. So yes, let's go to the purpose of grief recovery. So the purpose of grief recovery, the reason why it came is for many reasons. It came to the door of our Native people because we were recovering from COVID. This was something that came onto the reservation, and COVID took so many people we loved. And we began to see that we didn't see it. We couldn't see it coming. But there's other types of griefs that's happened. So I'm just gonna name some more, and I know you can think of a lot more. Types of grief is moving, loss of a pet, financial loss, loss of health, a significant, you know, a loss of someone you love in your life. There's a story and that someone told me that they knew a person in a store, never knew their name. And they realized that that woman who he had a friendly hello, how you doing? Every morning, one morning, she wasn't there. He was like, oh, I really miss her. I wonder where she is. She passed away. And he said, I didn't know her name, but I never felt such immense grief for someone who is a part of my everyday. And so in acknowledging that, you know, I just want to bring it, you don't have to know the person's name to feel the grief. Tragic circumstances, suicide, that is something, you know, I personally deal with that grief, and it's something big on the, you know, it's the fourth leading cause of a lot of our Native people across the nation. Murder, MMIWP, because that doesn't only bring grief, it brings thoughts of how do we begin to heal from things that was out of our control or we don't have knowledge of. And that is what brings us into a state of rage, feeling injustice. And I think with grief recovery, we begin to heal. Now, it's not condoning anything that's happened. It's beginning to see, okay, we're going to take this prickly feeling off of our skin so we can feel safe in our skin again. Types of intangible griefs, and people may not understand this. Trust, you know, you may have someone you look up. I'm just giving an example. You may have look up to somebody and you always rely on them to do the right thing, and they do something that's not, you lose that trust, you know, and that's a grief. A feeling of safety. I think as parents or those who have nieces and nephews or just people we love, we begin to have that grief of safety because, you know, I remember the days of leaving your door unlocked. Respect, faith. A lot of times that's a secondary grief we have after we look at historical things. You know, we have that rage, and yet we have a lot of great people in our community that are faith-based, and it's hard, and it's really hard that we begin to lose faith, but that is a grief also besides hope. So the goal of grief recovery on the reservation, besides, you know, I've worked with many, and MMIP has been some that have been what we do together to begin to work through. Our goal is to help complete your relationship to the pain, to the isolation, the loneliness caused by that significant emotional loss. So what I'm saying is we are here with all of these things, but we are also trying to find the power. Like, I'm very thankful for what Emily said. We're finding the power to begin to go into this next part of the journey. Okay. So just to talk a little bit more, expand more, grief intangible and fairness, the unfairness of a murdered loved one. Sometimes we know what that is, and sometimes we don't. And sometimes we dissociate so that we can survive. Fairness, the unfairness of it all. We don't know, or why did our loved one have to die this way? What is left emotionally unfinished for you as a result of the death? We can carry the energy of anger and denial with no closure. With the action of grief recovery method, a person, a family can become better advocates while pursuing justice. A lawsuit and judgment cannot heal a broken heart. That work is done from inside. So I just want to go back to that one little bullet. When people begin, especially when we have a lot that have been recovering from, for example, sexual abuse or any type of violent act against them, let them be a woman or a man, taking grief recovery begins to loosen that armor in which we use to protect ourselves. And we're doing that not just individually, we're starting individual, but we're also doing that as a people to really begin to see how can we live in this world and not live in that past. And it does, after a lot of times in other places, the grief recovery is used for those victims of those particular type, and they end up becoming better advocates for themselves when they're pursuing justice. And I think that's something because they're beginning to heal, because we can't go back in time. Could you imagine if that could ever happen? But we can't, right now, we're going forward. And this is a way that can help somebody live with themselves, and not that they carry any guilt, but that they don't begin to hurt themselves with reliving a trauma. So next one, the grief intangible with unfairness of a missing loved one. Continued here, unfairness of it all. Where is my loved one? A lot of times we don't know, and sometimes not knowing is the worst thing. How can I grieve for someone who's missing? Should I grieve for them if they are alive or found? And what does our tradition say about missing people and saying and speaking their names? Just a little instant, or just a little thought. A lot of traditions with Native people, and especially where we're from, we don't say their names for a year in grief. That's how we respect and love and begin to heal. When we do talk about them, even after memorial, we'll call them Atwai, our beloved. And so you'll hear Atwai, someone who's gone, that is their words. Victims have difficulty because of their long relationship with pain. So what we're doing is we're trying to keep our victims from living a victim mentality. Not that they're always going to be victims, but they carry the hurt from being a victim. So why do we need grief recovery on the Yakima Reservation? Okay, did I mess up my slides? I did, sorry. Think about your journey through grief. So again, I'm telling you what's happening on our res, but I want you guys to think about your journey. How would your life change if you can resolve grief? How do you think you can become an emotional leader? I just want you to have a few thoughts about that. I am going to tell you what I've learned through what I've worked with elders. Most of my support groups are elders, and I've never seen somebody come in with so much on their shoulders. And after this particular recovery method we do with them, they have such a shine and light, and they're walking on air because they're able to begin to heal, and they feel, and they're ready to think and love. And when they hug their grandchildren, they feel it. And so that is something I'm glad to have. But a lot of times before we get to that journey, we cope. Okay. Okay. We begin to cope with grief. And what does coping look like? Sometimes it's not always great. How do we deal with our feelings? And some things are not always good for us. And these are the different things. The short-term energy relieving behaviors. Drinking, and that's not water, that's alcohol, exercising excessively, working, workaholics, smoking, sex, eating, fighting, dissociating, spending money, online shopping, gambling. These are all habits that can turn to addictions and self-sabotage. It doesn't matter who you are. That's what happens sometimes with grief. Now I'm on the right slide. So why do we need grief recovery here on the Yakima Reservation? Well, number one, there's no shortage of broken-hearted people. And those broken hearts may be due to, cause of death. And sometimes it's not long ago, it's historical. I carry the name of our treaty signer's older sister. I always wonder, that's my connection to the past. I think, what was she thinking? What was she doing? Did she have to take care of a lot of people, and I think that. And maybe caused, we also have, grief and loss may be caused by divorce, a breakup in a family, a friendship, a romantic relationship, maybe caused by there's over 40 different types of grief we can experience in our life, for those who don't know. But I'm not leaving you hopeless. I want to tell you how we begin to use what we know to help those family members and those people. So what is grief recovery method? I'm a grief recovery specialist, so I was trained, and we do an 8-week session with individuals. We do support groups or individuals. And I put it as a challenge to get rid of your broken heart. They are given homework, and a lot of times you're like, oh, this is no fun. I want to just talk it off and vent and then throw it off from my chest, but you know what? It grows right back. This is a group. Sometimes we do group work or we do one-on-one. There's no comparing losses in there. We always have, I've seen a woman who've come in and really relate to someone who had a divorce and she lost her pet. We don't compare loss. Because even though you're gonna have 40 people in here, all have been through divorce, their grief is not the same. Grief for that person, for that one loss, is all 100% unique to that person. We are totally honest with each other. That's total honesty. And I know that's weird in this world, but we're at a point where we're like, look, you're safe here. And we make each other safe first. Absolute confidentiality. No analyzing how many people. I have a mother who worked for the government for 40 years in behavioral health. I try to get out of that bad habit of analyzing, trying to find an answer to the why. No judging, no criticizing or fixing others' griefs. I'm an ex-social worker in recovery. No, I'm kidding. But social workers, you come to my table, I'm gonna try to help you and find out what I can do to make things better. Sometimes listening is the biggest part. Completeness is, again, total honesty, and we end up communicating better and being more clear. Like I said, I've seen many elders and many women who've lost their loved ones to MMIP, missing Indigenous people, or murdered. And after they're able to go through the 8-week, and it's grueling, it's very taxing, but this journey, they end up leaving so strong. And I'm very glad to be able to see that happening, because I consider myself an emotional leader. I consider myself someone who will listen to you with much love, dignity, and respect. So with that open-mindedness, we call ourselves hearts with ears. And my elder women, we're Tiamat with Mishus, which is heart with ears in our language. And I really love that about them. But I just want you to know, as we go through a lot of things and we're looking and we're really inspecting what has happened and finding out what's true or not, we are taking care of ourselves, not just as Native people, but as human beings, to see how we can go forth and again, learn from the past, learn from what has happened, so that in the future can be better, but most important, that our present feelings, our present of who we are, can be validated as human beings. So that's what I do. I know it's a little off the difference of the historical, but I want you to know this is what we're doing. It's not a Band-Aid. It's a growth and rejuvenation that we're trying to do. So I hope that gives you a little bit of, it really is a warrior's walk to go through your own heart and your mind. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I'm not good at transitioning.
Okay,
Thank you,
well,
Diane.
comment on-
Yeah, and one of the other aspects, of course, is we hear again from our elder Patsy about this process a number of times and the things that are brought up. We work with a number of press as well as, that do the breaking news as well as ourselves. And there's a lot that comes up because there's so many cases. And I think that part about being in a community and being here also includes, revisiting when we need to do more self-care, right? Like I was eating a lot of M&Ms and s'mores during some of the cases. Like I wasn't eating healthy. I would, and then I went the other range. I was taking so many walks and then I was like, okay, now I'm doing the over exercising, over healthy. And, and we see that pretty frequently with people that are involved in this work, because it's rapid response. And if you're not there and if you're not present, then who might be missed, or what clue or what little detail might be missed as a result of that. And so, holding this close and thinking about it, as well as thinking about, the things that get brought up with history is all very important.
Thank you, Diane. Be with you for sharing that. I'm sure Be With You had great words for Alabama too. During those hard times, and like, well, what do I do? You call me to this meeting. Should I go? Should I not go? And when I went to the University of Washington and I studied American Indian Studies, I had realized that it was probably one of the hardest things to study as a Native person, because it is like constantly gruesome. It is constantly seeing history giving the shorthand to the Native people just because we were here. And so thank you, Emily, for sharing kind of how you coped. I coped very similarly when learning those histories as well, which was just overeating and sleeping a lot and, isolating at times, because it's like, oh, I gotta read another chapter of this book. I gotta read what happened after that. And I already knew what happened after that. But learning why and how was probably one of the more harder things to do. And so I felt, and I'm very thankful for my sister to be here to talk about that, because the connection between history and how we're going to cope with it, even just learning about history, we need to be able to have support to do that. So if you've ever watched any of our early episodes, we did constantly ask our guests, like, you do this hard work in your community, you're an MMIW advocate, you're an MMIW family member, what are you doing to take care of yourself on that journey? And that is a big part of, like Diane said, being a good advocate is taking care of yourself. Our elders often do say that, it's like, you can't help people if, you're not here. If you're too tired, or if you can't, if you're too sick, so you need to take care of yourself. And so did you want me to talk about this?
Oh, yeah.
So on our website, we have, we understand that there's MMIW stories and families and people who want to advocate in all areas, not just on the reservations, but also in urban Indian areas. So Portland being a very large urban Indian center, we want to be able to open this up to anybody in the community, or if you know anybody back home. We have a form on our website that is, if you have anybody that wants to be interviewed or talk about their story. A lot of times family members just want to be able to share that story, to be a part of that, to record who their family member was that they'd like to talk about. Or we have advocates from different areas who just want to talk about the work that they do, so that it can be known to everybody, to a larger field. So if you know anybody, welcome, have them fill out a very short survey form, and then we can talk to them. Or even if you have a suggestion, we can always reach out to them and for future episodes.
Okay, we might stop the recording on questions just because of mic stuff, but we can take some of your questions. Or you can respond to some of the questions that we had brought up already. if that something came up for you and you just want to share it.